With their tank formations, the Germans almost defeated boundless Russia. After the Stalingrad shock, they were determined to break the Russian resistance with a new offensive. Never again have the Wehrmacht been able to throw such huge forces into battle. However, he was defeated. In the summer of 1943, from the point of view of the Berlin High Command, the situation was serious, but not hopeless. Despite the defeat in North Africa, not a single soldier of the Western Allies has yet set foot on the European continent. The disaster at Stalingrad in January 1943 came as a shock to the Germans, but the Russians failed to take advantage of the defeat of the Sixth Army to achieve success in a large area. True, they tried to cut off the entire sector of the German front up to the Caucasus, but the German strategist Erich Manstein defeated the Soviet formations with his counteroffensive during the Second Battle for Kharkov. The troops that the Germans pushed back from the Volga were no more. The Kremlin was also in shock, as the Americans who were in Moscow at that time write about. Opponents gave each other a break. The Germans hoped for spring, when the Russian winter would end and their tanks would once again find solid ground under their tracks. With an offensive in a limited space, the Germans wanted to seize the initiative on the Eastern Front again. The so-called Operation Citadel did not set itself large strategic goals. The blows were to be delivered from both sides of the protrusion of the Russian front in the region of Orel and Kursk. If successful, the Germans would have managed to straighten the front line. The specific goal of the operation was to defeat the Soviet troops in this segment. Hitler concentrated large forces in a limited space. To support the offensive, the German military industry prepared an incredible number of new types of weapons that were never, or at least rarely, used on such a scale. The German multiple rocket launchers, the so-called Nebelwerfer, were a kind of competitor to the Russian Katyushas. Heavy Tiger tanks with fearsome 8.8 centimeters guns arrived at the front in large numbers, joined by the Ferdinands, newly developed heavy self-propelled guns of the tank destroyer class with long guns, also in 8.8 centimeters. For the first time, it was supposed to use the German Type V tanks, the so-called Panthers. The Panther is considered the most successful German tank of World War II. He absorbed many elements of the revolutionary Soviet T-34 tank, improved them, and combined them with the qualities that allowed German tanks to take a leading position. Numerous less spectacular new items were added to them. For example, the Goliath tracked self-propelled mine with remote control. During that period of the war, the Germans did not yet experience the shortage of ammunition and fuel, which later led to the paralysis of major military operations. Stalinist countermeasures near Kursk. Probably even a year earlier, no one could have stopped this force. Nevertheless, the offensive near Kursk ended in a decisive defeat for the Germans, because the Soviets were no longer the same as in the summer of 1942. The Battle of Kursk became the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, the point of no return. Stalin learned a lot. The Iron Leader, although he retained all the levers of control in his hands, no longer intervened personally in operational planning. For the Russians, the German preparations did not go unnoticed. It was not difficult to guess that the goal of the German offensive would be a ledge between Kursk and Orel, and it was impossible not to see the concentration of German troops. In addition, thanks to intelligence reports, the Russian High Command had detailed information about the German formations and the planned directions of strikes. At first, the reaction of the Russians did not seem unusual. Moscow consistently relied on wearing down German formations. After the Kharkov shock, they rightly considered their own tank formations incapable of resisting the German troops in a gigantic mobile battle. Defense masters. Instead, the Red Army organized a defense line in depth. She had enough time for this because the Germans had to wait a long time for their miracle weapon. Subsequently, it became clear that the German offensive in early May would have been much more successful because the enemy took advantage of the pause better. Bunkers, trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, hidden artillery positions extended deep into the Russian rear. And unlike the Germans, the Soviets managed to keep their preparations secret. For this purpose, construction and road works were carried out under a tarpaulin stretched for kilometers. In addition, the defensive positions were arranged much more intelligently than ever before. They no longer reproduced the patterns of the First World War, but were designed to stop the advance of tank troops. For example, especially fortified sections of the front with minefields were supposed to encourage the Germans to break through in less fortified areas. But after a successful breakthrough, they found themselves in a fire trap because they came under fire from hidden defensive positions. In addition, Russian tanks were not supposed to participate in battles as mobile forces. For the first time in this war, they were dug into the ground up to the hull. It is believed that this innovation was invented by Nikita Khrushchev. Soviet aviation was added to this. Previously, Red pilots played a secondary role in the war, but despite the failures at the beginning of the battle, they had a decisive influence on the battles near Kurs and Orel. This was facilitated by the fact that the Soviets had the best fighters of the time. Contrary to the Soviet mentality, the Il-2 attack aircraft protected their crews like no other aircraft. They were in a kind of armored steel bath. Thanks to this, these fighters were called concrete aircraft by the Germans. They even withstood direct hits from 20mm cannons. By the way, some of these aircraft were equipped with 237mm automatic cannons located under the wings. With a similar configuration of the Junkers 87, the German pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel scored his many victories in the air. It was impossible for Hitler's troops to break through to Kursk. Already in the first hours of the offensive, it became clear that advancement was possible only if the most fierce resistance was overcome, because the well-equipped defensive positions were combined with the readiness of the Russian leadership to put up with huge losses. Yes, and the Soviet soldiers were ready to continue the fight even in situations that did not leave them personally any chance. When the German tank units on the southern flank began to move on July 5, 1943, their vanguard was met by 1,000 riflemen with mines, hand grenades, and anti-tank rifles. These soldiers had no chance of winning. Their role was to delay advancing troops for a short time. The German offensive at the first moment should have lost momentum. The Russian soldiers showed the Germans that they would not give anything away for free. However, the time for senseless heroism is over. Now even the Soviets sent their soldiers into battle in small groups, realizing that attacks in thick three-row chains were futile. The Soviet victory on the Eastern Front was primarily the result of Soviet defense measures. Only a successful defense paved the way for a successful offensive operation. In addition, the development of a successful defense at the strategic and operational level depended on the extent to which the Soviets managed to stop the German attacks at the tactical level. It was in this area that the Soviets had big problems at first, but the Battle of Kursk became their masterpiece. The German television series Our Mothers, Our Fathers shows scenes of fierce fighting on the Kursk Bulge. It quickly became clear that the offensive was doomed to failure. A particularly bitter disappointment for the Germans was that it was the new tanks that showed their worthlessness. The whole concept of heavy self-propelled guns, Ferdinand, was incapacitated. The Colossus was too vulnerable to side hits and could not defend itself against infantry. Although the Panther later became the favorite vehicle of German tankers, in the summer of 1942, the model suffered more from childhood illnesses and breakdowns than the T-34. The troops of the northern German flank were unable to break through the Russian defenses. After July 9, offensive operations in the north had to be stopped. The offensive in the south advanced slowly, but the Germans failed to gain a foothold in the conquered positions, and without the northern flank, there was nothing to think about completely cutting off the Russian ledge. Instead, it was decided to make a small sickle incision in the southern sector of the front, the biggest tank battle in history. On July 12, the German armored vanguard reached the last line of prepared Russian defenses. At that moment, the Russian command brought its mobile reserve into battle against the battered Germans. Near the village of Prokhorovka, German tanks ran into a T-34 of the 5th Guards Tank Army. There during the day, the females of the great tank battle of the Second World War and history in general unfolded. Later, a lot of fiction and myths arose around the battle at Prokhorovka. Most of these stories are not true, but what is certain is that after this battle, Hitler ordered an interruption of the offensive. Vasily Chukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, described this battle in his book From Stalingrad to Berlin. the Battle of Kursk, the crossing of the Dnieper, and the liberation of Kiev became a disaster for the Nazis. A year later, the Soviets carried out the so-called Deep Operation against the Germans. They won. During the Operation Bagration, the German Army Group Center was almost completely defeated. After the end of the fighting near Prokhorovka, the last big offensive operation of the German Wehrmacht in Russia also ended ingloriously. Since then, the Germans in the East have only retreated. They were no longer capable of more than sporadic counterattacks.